bumblebees in the state, and as you probably have read, this particular critter, the rusty patch bumblebee, is now officially an endangered species. It's on the federal list. It has been cited a couple of times in Maine since 2000, more frequently before, and we're really interested in seeing if this species is still existent, still around in Maine, and if so, how it's doing. I will say that we have 4 or 5 other species in Maine that also were really much more abundant historically that we're hardly seeing at all now. So we often think about honeybee declines. Some of the same things that are driving honeybee declines are driving native pollinator declines too. All right, at this point, I'm going to pretend I took this picture and open it up for questions.
What's the latitude range north to south here for?
What's that one more time?
Latitude. What's the range in latitude that these guys inhabit?
That's a good question. I don't think I can answer that question, actually. I'm trying to think, in Canada, how far north we find records of these. Well, let me put it this way. We find there are dragonflies in Alaska, if that helps. So, not many, but they're there. All the way up to the Bering Sea, probably not. I'm guessing not, but I don't really know for sure what the absolute limit is northward.
And probably not in deserts, but everywhere else.
There's some desert species if there's water. See, the water's the critical thing. And it's got to be water that persists long enough for the developmental period. So I often get asked, how long is that larval stage? Well, it depends on the species. Some species have a couple of generations during the summer, so the larval period is really short, 6 weeks. Some species, it's 2 to 3 years. So much of their life, they're a larva. And then they emerge as an adult. Most adult dragonflies don't live longer than 6 weeks. Many, it's probably 2 or 3 weeks. Most damselflies, maybe as long as 4 weeks, probably closer to 10 to 14 days as adults. So they're just eating and mating. That's what it's about at that point.
Back to any relationship between beaver populations and damselfly populations, since they depend on water?
Not per se. I only know that beaver ponds, it depends on the beaver pond. As it turns out, I worked on beavers for a while during my career. But in the beaver ponds in which there's still aquatic vegetation remaining, there are lots of dragonflies and damselflies. But some beaver ponds are quite silty, and the beavers themselves eat aquatic vegetation. If the pond is small and the beaver colony has been there for a while, they oftentimes have cleaned a bunch of that vegetation out, and they keep it pruned really well every single summer. And so the damselfly diversity at those sites is low. So, yeah.
When you have an area where an endangered species is found, what are the protection actions that are typically done? If we, for example, found a rare damselfly in some corner of Merrymeeting Bay, what would happen? Would the state put boating regulations in, or what? What would?
Well, let me put it this way. The one endangered species that's federally listed, the state has to comply with federal laws on this, is one that only breeds in peat bogs. So not likely to be an issue for most people in terms of recreation, access, home building, or anything else. If there were to be one, well, let me back up. There are some listed species that are both threatened and or species of special concern on the state list. And what happens with those species is this: if you decide you want to build a new house or put in a subdivision or do some kind of a development immediately because they're on the list, that triggers EPA and DEP and IFW review of that project. And they don't always stop the project, but they may add provisos for the projects moving forward based on the status of that particular species. Now, if you're asking me what happens if you're out in front of your camp and suddenly you find a listed species there, probably nothing. Probably nothing. It's rare for the government to step in and say, okay, now we have an endangered species here, you have to get out of your camp and that kind of thing. That's not usually the way things work, if that helps. From the collection point of view, from the sampling point of view, with the bee program, for example, we have certain townships now in Maine that the feds will not allow us to collect in because people may inadvertently collect the endangered species. Now they can do photographic collection, but they can't do lethal collection like you would do with a bug collection.
I was unaware that you pointed to a couple of pictures where they were immature and the coloration was different as an adult. How does that transition take place if there's no molt involved?
Sometimes it's the fact that the pigment hasn't fully been produced in the abundance it's normally going to be produced in. Sometimes it's less to do with pigmentation than it has to do with light refracting through the exoskeleton, the external skeleton of the insect, which hasn't hardened off yet. And so it's a combination of those things, actual pigment production and changes in the skeletal structure. So as ultraviolet light and so forth impacts the skeleton, it changes the configuration of the proteins in it, and that changes the way light refracts and reflects back through once it strikes it. So that contributes to that.
And are there any coordinated times when you could consider a dragon or damselfly hatch from the point of view?
Well, so the problem is they're seasonal. So, the meadowhawks, for example, aren't going to start hatching out. They're not going to start emerging. So what I couldn't show you, because the Mac PC thing was, that final larva, okay, that's going to become an adult, having been in the water now for months, years, crawls out of the water. And the short-legged species tend to just crawl out a little bit. And long-legged species may walk 100 feet and up the side of your house, right? And it's going to grab on to wherever it ends up. Because inside now is actually the adult. And so what happens is sort of the exoskeleton splits down the back, the adult emerges, right? Because meanwhile the larval casing is hanging on, right? The adult emerges from that. I can't do this, but basically the head starts going over backwards, and then it sort of does a handspring and re-grabs that larval casing, which is holding on, and its wings will be straight up in the air now, if it's a dragonfly, and it will start pumping air and body fluid, hemolymph through the arterial system, straighten those wings out, right? And it will start to what we call harden off. And depending upon the humidity and the temperature, in anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, it'll be ready to take its first flight, and it will leave the larval casing behind. So again, when you see these things coming out of the water, what you have to appreciate is the much larger dragonfly is actually in there. Okay? It's already done all of the transition it's going to do. It just needs to break out of that casing after the larval actually hangs on to something. So
I guess my question is, do they tend to do this in groups at the same time?
It depends. So damselflies, yes. Dragonflies, not. Dragonflies do, but they're spread out more. Damselflies can sometimes emerge by the thousands, sort of like mayflies do. But if you're asking me for a specific date, depends on the species, depends on the weather for that particular season, yeah.
Has that process you just described ever been filmed? I mean, is there some place?
Oh, absolutely. Go online and Google dragonfly emergence. You can see all sorts of videos, and yeah, it's really cool. Yeah.
Is it Dr. Frankenstein? Doctor, what the heck heck is actually flying? If what's crawling? If a larvae is crawling and attaching onto something, and then this creature is breaking out, what the heck is controlling the walking?
Oh, so again, here's the adult. The adults, if you want to think about it, the adult's wearing a larval suit at that point. That's all it is. It's wearing a larval suit.
Okay.
And so its legs moving the whole 9 yards. It grabs on, and then it basically withdraws from all of that. It literally withdraws its legs from the legs in the suit and everything else, right? It splits out the back, and it leaves the suit behind. That's essentially what's going on there. So again, adult dragonflies don't grow, right? They're as big as they're going to be. They can get heavier, but they don't get bigger. Their size is determined by the last 2 larval stages and how much food that larva got. So the more food that larva gets in those last couple of stages, the bigger the adult's going to be when it actually emerges.
And they can be underwater for how long?
Some species, a couple of years.
Wow.
Yep.
And they live for how long when they're...
Adult dragonflies, probably not more than 6 weeks.
Oh, gee.
So the green darner that I showed you, that's one of the migratory species. Here's what's happening. The darners who hatched out, emerged farther south, are coming to Maine, right? They're going to get to Maine, and they're going to breed, okay? And that's going to produce a resident generation. That generation will come out. They'll be around during the summertime. They'll breed, and then a migratory generation is going to emerge, and that generation is leaving at the end of the summer, moving south again. Okay? Yeah.
When you talk about the larvae going through several stages, does it molt as a larvae into a bigger shell, like a larva?
It has to. It has to. Absolutely has to. That's the problem that all insects and other arthropods have. The skeleton's on the outside. How can you grow? It's fixed, right? And so anytime they grow, they have to get rid of the old skeleton. They've already grown a new one on the inside, emerge. They tend to pump water into it to make it bigger, right? It hardens, and then they've got room to grow into that new, bigger exoskeleton. And so for dragonfly species, that's 9 to 13 of those molts during the course of their life. Yeah.
Now, from the egg, I think I saw there was some larval, different larval shapes till it got to that really.
Yeah, we have this, and it varies in some species what this thing looks like. It's not a larva, so we just call it the prolarva. It's a thing that hatches out of the egg before it actually becomes a larva. So in some dragonflies and damselflies, the eggs overwinter. In some, the eggs hatch and the prolarvae overwinter. And in some, larvae will actually overwinter. So
Overwinter, they're in mud.
they're in the water.
No?
Yeah, they're in the water. The exception with damselflies, who always inject their eggs into plants.
Okay,
And so sometimes the water falls in the winter. And so those guys are actually high and dry in the plant stems. And so they can be out of the water, but...
A couple of questions. How many eggs will hatch out of any of these couplings? And in terms of migration, is there fidelity to where they came from, like an anadromous fish?
No.
Would have a chemical.
Hundreds, usually not thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds. No, there's no known examples of region, but not a specific pond, or no, at least not that we know of.
Is there one website that might have links to most of the other ones, rather than trying to remember a whole lot?
Maine damselfly and dragonflies, just it'll come right up.
When you're surveying, you are killing sometimes releasing?
Depends.
Is it tough to handle them without killing them?
No, dragonflies are probably the toughest insects you can handle next to beetles. Okay, I've hit dragonflies at 40 miles an hour, crushed against my windshield, wing caught under it. I get out, I take it out, new specimen. Right? So here's the issue with citizen science initiatives. We have to set up the protocol so that, I don't know, Aaron is basically me in the field. He doesn't have to know anything about anything. But when he collects data, that wasn't a comment, that was just... the data point he collects has to be the same one I'd collect. And so what that really means is we have to have a way to validate what it is he says he saw. And the most surefire way is to actually have the bug. So that involves lethal collecting. Okay? And people feel terrible about it. And I only tell people what the guy who trained me said to me. He said, the day I stop feeling bad about it is the day I'll stop doing it. But what we feel, I believe, and it's absolutely been proven, is the effort is actually helping the species much more than not doing anything. And so what happens with these kinds of things, we do this all the same way. You know, I'm considered a regional expert, but somebody checks my species too. So we always hire a national authority on that particular group of insects, and everybody who participates, all of their bugs go to that one person for that person to confirm the identifications. Dragonflies don't lend themselves to this, but the butterfly and bee projects do more readily, and that is photographs, images, digital images. And so we have some people that just, all they do is they hand capture things, take lots of pictures of them, paste those pictures in a Word document, and they send that to the expert. And that's fine. That's, you know, kind of catch and release. So, and I do that, by the way, somebody said bumblebees are out now. Those are all queens, okay? There are no workers right now, just queens. These are females that want to found a colony. So I never collect queens. I always catch them in a petri dish. I take lots of photographs of them, and I make a specimen, let them go. So the workers won't appear for probably another 3-4 weeks, anyway.
You're talking about bumblebees?
Yeah. So the females, the queens out about as big as your thumb right now. The first workers sit on your fingernail. They're really small because they haven't had much food. As the season progresses and the queen produces more and more generations of workers, there's more food around, there's more nectar and pollen, and so those females, the workers, will get bigger as the summer progresses, until that last generation themselves will be next year's queens. But that's a different order of insects. So.
You need to set the hook before you...
Right. Other questions?
I saw some bumblebees in my backyard 4 or 5 days ago.
Yeah, there's definitely so early in the season, most people don't realize, and there's actually lots of native pollinators, lots of minor bees out, those tiny little bees you see flying around. So actually tree flowers are a really important source of food for these guys at this time of the year. Things like red maples, sugar maples are really important. Yeah, so.
Is all the rain like making the tree blossoming dry pollen? Is that a problem?
No, actually, last summer was a terrible summer for bees of all sorts. When it's very dry, plants have problems making nectar, and nectar is what they feed on. Pollen is what they grow their young on. They don't eat the pollen. Well, the queens do to make eggs, but the workers don't eat. They eat the nectar, and the nectar was just really, really scarce. And so places where I survey bumblebees, I probably had 1/20th the number of bees that I would normally see. All summer long, where I live anyway.
So if somebody were interested in your survey, helping you do that survey, like what kind of size space do people get assigned? Or do you just find them as you kayak?
If you join the bumblebee survey, it's always the same. Go wherever you want.
Yes.
Wherever you decide to survey is where you survey.
But I was thinking of your survey.
Yeah, I'd like to send you all up there in the county someplace where there's no roads, okay? And that's exactly the response I get, right? So what's going to happen, you know, this is only the third year of the survey. We're going to do at least 2 more years of that survey. And by the way, as it turns out, the most recent sightings of the endangered species have been kind of in, you know, close to the coast, southern mid-coast Maine. That's where they were found. So possibly even here. I mean, they still may be here. We just haven't looked enough to see. Okay. What we normally tell people is, you know, it's pretty wide open. You know, you can't tell volunteers what to do. I mean, we can encourage you what to do. In about year 5, I'm probably going to say, guys, you know, you see all those white squares? Could somebody go to some of those white squares? But normally, no. Normally, you know, we just encourage. We have a couple of agendas here. One's the conservation agenda and what we're trying to do with native pollinators or butterflies, which are native pollinators, or dragonflies. But we also find that you get people involved in this and they become zealots. Okay? And you know what? You start looking at bumblebees, you're going to start looking at minor bees. And you start looking at minor bees, you're going to start looking at sweat bees. And you look at sweat bees, you're going to start looking at megacylids and all sorts of other. And you're going to say, I've got like 300 bees coming to these flowers. You know, it hooks you. It hooks you. It really does. I'm not lying. You're going to see. Other questions?
With the dragonflies, damselflies, you generally go into some wet area, whether it's a swamp or a wetland or a lake shore or stream. Or...
So here's the deal with the dragonflies and the butterfly surveys. Those surveys are over now. So what we're interested in is not people just going out and collecting and sending us. We're interested in any new species. Any of the species that are on the list that are indicated as being of special concern, rare species, a species that you happen to find that if you go to the website isn't listed for that county or that township, we're interested in that kind of stuff. So right now I just get a trickle of contributions for dragonflies or butterflies now. And most of our active urging people to get out in the field and collect is really focused on bumblebees right now. So, but the short answer to your question, if there's water, there's something that uses it in the odonata. Okay, and in just little things too. So for example, little seeps. There's a species of damselfly that actually specializes on those little seeps. That's the only place you find it. You don't find it at ponds or streams or anything. These little couple little sedges. It's always wet, a little bit of water there. You always find this little red damselfly. Only there. Yep.
What's sort of the range of dragonflies and damselflies? Like
In
their adults flying around?
Oh, good question. There's a species of dragonfly that's been found 3,000 miles out to sea on ships, lands on ships. It's called a wandering glider. So dragonflies can travel vast distances. They're high-speed flyers, right? Damselflies, the jewel wings aside, the jewel wings actually fly quite a distance, but many damselflies hardly fly a dozen meters from where they emerge. So they stay really close to where they emerge. I've been on ponds where there are certain species that emerge in a really small area about this big. Now I'll find other areas on that pond with exactly the same kind of vegetation, but only in this cove do I find that particular species. This is where they emerge, that's where they stay. So. Anything else?
Are there any issues with handling dragonflies or damselflies, or biting or stinging?
Tear your face off. They have jaws. They can bite. I have handled thousands and not been bitten. So if you get one in a net, and you can net them and let them go, they're very hardy. You just reach in, and with dragonflies, just get their wings together, fold them back, right, and take them gently, because they're going to be biting the net and holding the net. And I've actually seen people, and the head is still hanging onto the net. And just pull gently, and they'll come out. You can look at them, and then you can let them, you can put them down, and they'll straighten their wings out and they'll fly away. So, if you do this, yeah, they're going to bite you. Okay, it doesn't hurt that much. Right? It's like bee stings. It's good for your arthritis. Yeah.
I often find when we're boating and canoeing that there'll be one that stays with us. You know, it'll land on my skin and sit there very comfortably, and then seem to want to keep doing that. I mean,
Dark colored with kind of green, like green yellow markings. Yeah. I almost guarantee you that I know what that species is, because it's a really common one. Every time I swim or go out in a boat or my dog is swimming, there's one on his head.
yeah.
It's called Dromogonphus spinosa. It's characteristic. Not out in the middle of the lake. You get close to the shore, they fly out and land on the boat. They land on your raft. Yep. Yep. I think you're a convenient perch. I know it's hard to take, but I think that's what it is.
I take that as flattery.
Thank you very much.
He needs a shirt.
I hope that you make that.